In the previous video, we examined some of the objections to the regularity theory. So today we'll look at the case for the regularity theory. So assuming the regularity theorist can answer the objections of the previous video, that of course leaves the question, why would anybody be attracted to the regularity theory in the first place? We saw that necessitarianism does seem to be the common sense view, and it is supported by some powerful arguments. What's wrong with necessitarianism then? Why should we resist it? Well, the first point, which maybe isn't so much an argument, it's more a kind of historical point perhaps that makes regularism attractive to people. With the rise of modern science, many people thought that we had uncovered the underlying order to the often confusing phenomena of the world. You know, things like Newton's laws were thought to apply universally. They could help us understand everything from the swinging of a pendulum to the orbit of the moon. Newton had discovered the principles that unite all phenomena. So how is this understood metaphysically? Well, traditionally, laws of nature were thought to have been laid down by God. Laws of nature were laws in a rather literal sense. They were rules set down by the designer that dictated the behaviour of material objects, analogously to how the designer also set down moral rules to dictate the behaviour of rational agents. God imposed laws of nature on the world and imposed moral laws on humans specifically. Now, of course, it was thought that we had free will to break the moral laws, but that nothing in the world could break the laws of nature. In both cases, though, these should be seen as being quite literally rules that govern the universe, and this was understood in relation to God. Now, of course, very few scientists or philosophers these days would be willing to accept this kind of story. There's a general commitment to naturalism, and naturalism is going to rule out explanations that appeal to actual, designers designing the universe. And the worry is that necessitarianism is a vestige of non-naturalistic thinking. It retains this notion of laws as governing rules, rules that nothing in the world can violate, but the concept of God is replaced with the concept of physical necessity. So, because of this, I guess, historical background, it seemed quite appealing to many philosophers to try to avoid thinking of laws in these kinds of terms. So a second motivation for regularity theory derives from Hume's sceptical attack on the concept of necessity. Hume's argument was made in the context of his famous discussion of causation, but it should be clear how it generalises to our case. So what is causation? What is causality? Well, when A causes B, there must be a constant conjunction between A and B, so that whenever A happens, B follows. Whenever one billiard ball moves towards another and strikes it, the other billiard ball moves. Actually, I suppose you want to say that constant conjunction isn't quite right, because we recognise that there might be probabilistic causation. But then, of course, we can say, well, whenever A happens, B follows with a certain probability. The point is there is a conjunction between the events. But the important point is there clearly must be more to causality than constant conjunction. And there are all kinds of different cases that illustrate this. Let's say you have an alarm that goes off at 7 AM and another one goes off 10 seconds later. We would not say that the first alarm causes the second one to go off, even though there is a constant conjunction between those events. It happens regularly every day. One alarm goes off, the other alarm follows, right? But we wouldn't say the first causes the second. So in addition to constant conjunction, we need what Hume called some sort of special necessary connection. The cause, in some sense, necessitates the effect. And Hume asks, well, what exactly justifies the claim that the cause is necessarily connected to the effect, that A is necessarily connected to B? First of all, the postulation of necessary connection clearly isn't justified by logical deduction. From the knowledge of A alone, we have no idea of knowing what B will be. From from the fact that one billiard ball has moved and hit another, well, this doesn't logically entail anything about what the other billiard ball will do. The other one, might shoot up in the air, or it might suddenly expand, or it might just disappear, or it might start spinning on the spot. The cause doesn't logically entail anything about the effect. We can only infer what will happen to the second ball on the basis of past experience with billiard balls, or things relevantly like billiard balls. And really, this is just the point that we're dealing here with some kind of physical necessity, not logical necessity. Okay, so this is of course true for the laws of nature as well. We can't logically deduce that nothing exceeds the speed of light. We only know this by investigating the world empirically. However, Hume then argues that necessary connection isn't justified through sensory experience either. All we ever actually perceive is constant conjunction. When one billiard ball strikes another and the other one moves, all you observe is one ball moving, and then it touches another, and then the other ball moves. There is no sensory impression of the necessity connecting these events. You don't see or feel or hear or whatever the necessity. All you can perceive are events occurring in a sequence. So, with respect to the laws of nature, well, the necessitarian view is that the laws tell us how things must behave. The laws involve physical necessity. The laws of our world necessitate that nothing exceeds the speed of light, that copper is conductive, and so on. But, applying Hume's points, well, what justifies the assumption of the postulation of necessity here? Well, it's not a matter of logical deduction, and as for observation, that can only reveal how the world actually is, not how it must be. So the Humean argument challenges that the notion of physical necessity just can't be justified. It might be worth noting, actually, just as a terminological point, that the regularity theory of laws is sometimes known as the Humean theory, after David Hume. So, if you do your own reading about this and you see people talk about the Humean theory of laws, there's a good chance they're talking about the regularity theory. But actually, it's not clear that Hume would have endorsed the regularity theory. Arguably, Hume was a necessitarian about laws. He was sceptical about how we acquire knowledge of necessity, and in fact how we acquire the very concept of necessity. His idea would be that laws of nature do postulate physical necessities, but then there's an epistemological problem explaining where knowledge of necessity comes from. But still, of course, you can see how we can use Hume's sceptical arguments to support a regularity theory of laws. Now, I think, the necessitarian might respond to this and say, well, Hume's standards are just too strict. After all, modern science postulates all kinds of unobservable things, like electrons, say. Electrons are not derived logically. We can't logically derive the existence of electrons from any of our observations. But similarly, electrons are not observed either. Nobody has ever seen an electron. You might actually, just as a side note, you might want to check out my series on scientific realism for more on the point about unobservables in science. But anyway, for the purpose of this video, scientists will suppose that there are many things in the world that we don't actually observe. So the necessitarian might say, necessity, the necessity involved in laws of nature is supported in a similar kind of way. It's a feature of our best scientific theories, and in the same way that we can reasonably believe in electrons, we can similarly reasonably believe in necessity, physical necessity in the world. But the regularist will, I think, insist that there's still a difference here, because there is no way, even in principle, of detecting necessity. No instrument can show us necessity bringing about irregularity in the world, and we can't see necessity in its effects on other things. On the other hand, we have all kinds of instruments that we can use to detect electrons, say, And even those things that are undetectable in our current instruments, like dark matter, can still be detected by the way they influence other things, like the behaviour of stars in galaxies. So when any new unobservable entity is postulated by scientists, well, they try to work out how to detect them, either directly in our instruments or indirectly in the effects that they have on other processes. That's not the case for necessity. Necessity is completely and in principle undetectable, and so the regularist will argue that it's a sort of idle concept. It's idle in a way that other unobservables are not. I mean, is there any evidence, even conceivably, which could sort of bear on the necessitarian view of laws? I mean, of course, we can imagine that the laws of nature might have been different. There's plenty of conceivable evidence that would show this and that would cause us to propose different laws. But could anything show that there are just no necessitarian laws, period? Well, surely not, because the necessitarian can only appeal to the observed regularities. But that's just the same as the evidence for the laws as understood by the regularity theory. So there's no way to put necessitarianism to an empirical test versus the regularity theory, which doesn't postulate physical necessities. I mean, a simple way of making this point is to imagine two worlds, call them W1 and W2, and these worlds are both exactly the same in terms of the events and processes that take place in them. Let's say they are molecule for molecule identical. In the placement of the fundamental particles is the same throughout all of time in both of these worlds. But W1 is law governed. There is a physical necessity underlying the events in W1, whereas W2 isn't. In W2 there are just the regularities. Clearly we have no way at all of distinguishing between these worlds, which is to say we couldn't possibly know which of these is the actual world that we live in. So the notion of physical necessity is just unempirical and explanatorily idle in a way that other unobservables aren't. Now, I think one response the necessitarian might make here is, well, isn't this the same kind of argument that a radical skeptic would use? So radical skepticism is the view that we have no justification for believing that there is an external world. And at least one way of arguing for radical skepticism is to appeal to scenarios like the brain in the vat. Imagine that a brilliant evil scientist has taken your brain and placed it in a vat, and all of your sensory experiences are actually being produced by some very sophisticated equipment in the scientist's lab. So we can imagine two people, P1 and P2. P1 and P2 both have exactly the same thoughts and experiences. Their brains are exactly the same, but P1 is actually housed in a vat, whereas P2's experiences are veridical. He really is wandering around in the world as he seems to be. The skeptic's point is that from the point of view of these two people, the experiences are indistinguishable. So in that case, surely you would have no way of knowing what your situation is. For all you know, the world that you think you inhabit might be a massive illusion. And so, of course, the necessitarian's point here is the type of argument used by the regularity theorist to undermine necessitarianism is actually going to lead you all the way to radical skepticism. But we think, most philosophers are going to reject radical skepticism, so they would have to conclude that there must be something wrong with this type of argument. But I think the regularist would counter that there's an important disanalogy between the argument for regularism and the argument for skepticism. So with respect to perception of everyday objects, well, the non-skeptic thinks that we perceive objects in the external world. The skeptic, on the other hand, questions this. The skeptic suggests that, well, something else might be responsible for our sensory experiences. But here's a key point. Even the skeptic grants that perception of external objects is possible. The skeptic will grant that if there is an external world, and if our perceptual systems are built the right way, we will perceive external objects. The skeptic's claim is that we have no justification for thinking that these conditions hold. We have no justification for thinking that there's an external world, or that if there is, our perceptual systems are, hooked up to it in the right way. On the other hand, the point made by the regularity theorist is there is no possible perception, no possible means of detection of the necessitarian laws. Even if there are necessitarian laws, there is just no way that we could be hooked up to them, as it were. There is no way we could have any epistemological connection to them. So the idea is that common sense objects, everyday objects, account for our experiences in a way that the necessitarian laws do not and cannot. And so perhaps that's an important disanalogy between the argument for the regularity theory and the argument for skepticism. So a second necessitarian response to the problem of empirical confirmation is given by Fred Dretske in his article on laws of nature, and I think this is quite an interesting response. So the regularist challenges the idea that there can be any empirical confirmation of necessitarian law, but Dretske says, well, actually, regularism isn't in any better shape here. On regularity theory, we can't have any empirical evidence for the laws either, right? So both necessitarianism and regularity theory are in the same boat as far as this empirical confirmation goes. So here's what Dretske says. He says, well, suppose I have a coin that we both agree it's perfectly normal. It's a fair coin. We both agree with that. Now, I then say, I'm going to flip it 10 times and it's going to land heads each time. So the hypothesis is the coin will land heads 10 times. And that is perhaps an unreasonable hypothesis, given that I agree that it's a fair coin. But, whatever, that's what I'm saying. And this, of course, asserts a mere regularity. Because all that's happening here is we're expecting 10 heads in a row. So that's a mere regularity. Okay, so suppose I flip the coin and it lands heads 9 times. Well, notice that the probability of getting 10 heads is only, at this point, 0.5. I mean, in fact, notice that if you were to take a hypothesis that the coin will land heads on the 10th flip, well, the probability of that hypothesis doesn't change at all. It's always 0.5. Before you flip the coin, the probability that the 10th toss will be heads is 0.5. After flipping the coin 9 times, the probability that the 10th toss will be heads is still only 0.5. So after 9 favourable trials, we don't have any convincing reason to believe this regularity hypothesis that the coin will land 10 heads. Our ability to predict the 10th flip is exactly the same as it was before we flipped the coin 9 times. Now, of course, the probability of the hypothesis that the coin will land 10 heads does increase, but that's only because, as we land heads on the first 9 tosses, we have fewer tosses to land heads as we go forward. So just for that reason, the probability of the hypothesis will increase, but it can never go above 0.5. On the other hand, compare this to the hypothesis that the coin is biased towards heads. Well, if we believe this hypothesis, then the probability of getting heads on the 10th toss is greater than 0.5. So if our run of 9 heads confirms this hypothesis, we do have reason to expect that we would get heads on the 10th toss. I mean, we might, look at a coin and see that it has maybe an odd shape, or maybe it looks like it's weighted in a funny way or something like that, and we might suppose that this anomaly has biased the coin. Then if we flip it 9 times and it comes up heads each time, we've added confirmation to this hypothesis. and that will allow us to predict that the 10th flip will be heads as well. Now, the important point to notice is that in this second case, we've also confirmed the initial hypothesis. The initial hypothesis that the coin will land heads 10 times. This one asserts a mere regularity. But we have confirmed this mere regularity via confirming an intermediate hypothesis about the physical constitution of the coin, that the coin is biased towards heads. This intermediate hypothesis relates the physical structure of the coin to the frequency of heads. So it relates the physical structure of the coin to the regularity. Only this hypothesis can give us reason to expect that the unexamined case, the 10th toss, will be like the previous 9 tosses. The mere regularity is worthless here. So Dretske suggests that this same problem is going to rise for the confirmation of any kind of mere regularity. We can only confirm, say, that no object exceeds the speed of light via confirming an intermediate hypothesis that it is necessary that no object exceeds the speed of light, that the universe is constituted so as to prevent this. So if we are unable to have empirical confirmation of necessity, then in fact we're not going to be able to have any way of confirming mere regularities either. So if the regularity theorists attack on if the regularity theorists' argument that necessity has no that we have no justification for believing in necessity is right, then we're also going to have no justification for believing in mere regularities, in laws as mere regularities either, which would mean both regularity theory and necessitarianism are sort of in the same boat in this respect. So that's kind of an interesting point there. Okay, a third objection to necessitarianism. The necessitarian holds that the laws of nature govern the world. But what exactly is going on here? Right? How does this work? How do these laws of nature impose regularity on the world? We have no grasp of what this mystical, spooky power could be. In fact, the situation is worse than this. It's not just that we have no grasp of what this mystical power could be. Arguably, there's nothing even in principle that could do the job that laws are supposed to do. Let it be a law that all F's are G's, then of course the necessitarian says, well, it's going to be an exceptionless regularity that all F's are G's, and this is because of the law. But then we can ask, well, why shouldn't it be the case that there is a law that all F's are G's, but still some F's are not G's? I mean, now notice that for a regularity theorist, this question is unintelligible, because the law just is the regularity. But for the necessitarian, it looks like the question can at least be raised, because the law is treated as being something separate from the regularity. The law is something that explains the regularity. It's something that brings about the regularity, right? So in that case, we can ask, well, why shouldn't a world have a law, but then just not obey the law? What exactly is it that prevents this? Now, obviously, it won't be any good to say a law prevents it, because then we'd have not only a law necessitating that all F's are G's, we'd also have a law necessitating that if it is a law that all F's are G's, then necessarily all F's are in fact G's. And obviously we are on the way to an infinite regress of laws if we go down this path. So that's not going to be acceptable. So the point is, the necessitarian invokes laws to explain the regularity that all F's are G's, but then don't we also need to explain why, whenever we have a law, the world must follow that law? I mean, that would also appear to be a regularity in need of explanation, isn't it? So one response to this is to distinguish two versions of necessitarianism. First, there's the idea of laws of nature as literally existing separately from the rest of the world and imposing themselves on the world, constraining the behaviour of objects in the world. You know, that the laws impose necessity from above, as it were. Second, there's the idea that laws arise as a result of the dispositions or powers of objects. And these are, of course, just properties of objects. Necessity is not imposed from above, rather the necessity inheres in the objects themselves, as a cause necessitates an effect. Laws of nature describe the power of a cause to produce particular effects. So it's simply in the nature of copper to conduct electricity. It is in the nature of a neutrino to interact very weakly with other forms of matter. It is in the nature of uranium to go critical at 56 kilograms. And the argument then is that this third problem isn't applicable to this way of understanding necessitarianism, because we don't have to treat the law as being something separate from the objects it governs. Instead, you know, the necessity is, in a sense, it's like in the objects themselves, right? The objects have certain dispositions, and this is where the laws arise from. Now, of course, this is also a difficult idea to get one's head around. It's, again, rather unclear how this is supposed to work, and it's questionable whether this really avoids the problem. So let's say that uranium has the disposition to go critical at 56 kilograms. Well, this is still going to be something different from it's going critical at 56 kilograms, right? I mean, after all, if the disposition to go critical at 56 kilograms refers to nothing more than the fact that uranium goes critical at 56 kilograms, well, obviously that's nothing more than the regularity theory, right? So when the necessitarian says that uranium has the disposition to go critical at 56 kilograms, she's attributing a certain property to uranium, and this is something different from the property of going critical at 56 kilograms. But then it looks like we could ask, well, why shouldn't uranium have the disposition to go critical at 56 kilograms, but then fail to do so? What prevents this? Again, we face a regress. And a further problem, actually, is it's not clear that all laws can be understood in terms of dispositions of objects. Consider the law that no object exceeds the speed of light. Would we say that every object has a disposition never to exceed the speed of light? That seems a bit strange. And in fact, not only is it strange, but it lands the necessitarian with an unexplained regularity. So, you know, why does nothing accelerate faster than light? Well, because as you accelerate, you gain mass, and greater mass requires more energy to accelerate further. So as the velocity increases, you need to use ever-increasing amounts of energy to make ever smaller differences to your speed. Accelerating to light speed would require an infinite amount of energy. Now, okay, let's say we frame this in terms of the dispositions of objects. We might say maybe every object has a disposition to gain mass as it accelerates, such that accelerating to light speed would require infinite energy. But why does every object have the same disposition here, right? And why is it they all sort of increase in mass to the degree that infinite energy at light speed, right? Why is that? Clearly we have an unexplained regularity. So it's not clear that that appealing to dispositions, to the idea of laws arising from the dispositions of objects, is really going to be much use for the necessitarian, because we just get a bunch of other unexplained regularities, and the whole point of necessitarianism is to avoid that. Right, a final objection to necessitarianism concerns the nature of explanation. We saw in the last video that necessitarians demand an explanation for the regularities of the world, and they object that the regularity theory can't provide such explanations. But the regularity theorist will insist that the necessitarian explanation is no explanation at all. The notion of necessity is unempirical. It's a vestige of non-naturalistic thinking. It doesn't really do the job it's supposed to do in terms of getting rid of unexplained regularities, etc., etc. It's an idea that doesn't really contribute anything to to science. It's a pseudo-explanation, perhaps analogous to the famous example is a way that doctors of the past explained the fact that opium induces sleep by proposing that opium has a dormitive virtue. Well, what is a dormitive virtue? That looks to be like just another way of saying that it sends people to sleep. Obviously, that's a clear example of a pseudo-explanation. The regularity theorist says that necessitarianism is a pseudo-explanation in a similar way. So, the necessitarians, as we saw, demand an explanation. The regularity theorists will respond that the necessitarian explanation just fails as an explanation. But furthermore, many regularity theorists will go a bit further. And they will argue, look, there are limits to explanation. Explanations must come to an end at some point. I mean, this is really quite obvious. We can't keep explaining things forever. You could ask, why P because Q? Why Q because R? Why R because S? And so on and so on. Eventually, we have to stop because our lives are finite. And so, at what point should we say that we're satisfied? At what point should we say that we've reached the limit of proper explanations? Well, regularity theorists place the limit at the way the world is. Once we've described what's actually going on in the world, that's enough. And, I mean, it does make some sense to place the limit here because that's all that we have empirical access to. So it's understandable why you might say, okay, once we've described the events and processes in the world, that's where it ends. Necessitarians, as we saw, they demand further explanation. They posit physical necessity in order to explain why the world is the way it is. They invoke the way the world must be as a matter of law. A law of nature isn't just a regularity in the world, it's something that explains the regularities. But of course, we could now immediately issue a further demand for explanation. We could ask, why are the laws of nature the way they are? And yet necessitarians don't demand an answer to this one. Now, of course, for some scientific laws, like all copper conducts electricity, we can and do give further explanation by citing further facts about copper and about electromagnetism and so on. But recall, as we noted in the first video, for the necessitarian, something like all copper conducts electricity isn't really a law of nature. The genuine laws have yet to be uncovered. The genuine laws would be more like the most fundamental laws. The point is that once we have described the way the world actually is, that's going to be enough for the regularity theorist, but the necessitarian insists on further explanation beyond the mere regularities. So why should we take this further step? I suppose the necessitarian will object that yes, there are going to be limits to explanation in practice because we can't just keep explaining things. I mean, eventually explanations will hit a point where we can go no further, but surely we should try to explain as much as we can. Why would we stop prematurely? I mean, we have a phenomenon in the world that is puzzling, right? We have these regularities in the world and we want to know why. Postulating laws of nature seems to shed light on it. So it's a very natural step to take to postulate laws of nature. I think in response to this, the regularity theorist will grant that the necessitarian explanation seems very plausible, but considering the development of modern science, we should be aware that our intuitions about the world are often radically wrong. The development of science over the last few centuries has involved the destruction of all kinds of explanations that seemed very natural and obvious. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with speculation, but speculation doesn't make for a genuine explanation, and necessitarianism can never be anything more than mere speculation. So the regularity theorists are not going to be willing to go in for that, to believe that kind of hypothesis. I mean, this sort of debate about explanation really goes to the I suppose, the heart of the question of the scope of philosophy. I think it's fair to say that in general, necessitarians think that philosophy can kind of extend the work of the sciences. We can use philosophical analysis to go beyond where empirical investigation can take us and to uncover more of the fundamental structure of reality. So it's like, you know, scientists shine a light on some of the underlying structure of the world, but then philosophy can take us even further. It can shine the light further than where empirical science can go. Regularity theorists are much more cautious. They're going to tend to be more empiricist. They're going to think that the empirical sciences really provide our only access to how the world works, and you know that philosophy isn't really going to be able to extend that any further. So you know, this debate about the laws of nature is an important one. That's all for today. I think in the next video, if I do another video on this, probably going to look at a more sophisticated version of regularity theory. But that's all for now. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.